Here with the Digital Digest, and today I'm sharing yet another update on my experience with the Microsoft Surface Pro 11 for 2024. For those of you that have been following my coverage thus far, you know that I have been predominantly focused on the Snapdragon X Elite OLED models because, at least in theory, these should be the best Surface Pros ever made. In fact, I've been waiting since the Surface Pro was originally launched over a decade ago for an OLED option, and I am thrilled that Microsoft finally stepped up to the plate. Granted, very late, but better late than never. My focus, however, has recently shifted to the most affordable Surface Pro 11 that comes with the Snapdragon X Plus rather than the X Elite processor and an IPS display rather than an OLED. And for many of you, I'm sure that is a head scratcher, but today's video is going to be all about what is the difference in the performance of the chipset and, of course, the overall experience of the IPS versus OLED display. So let's start off with the displays. I'm going to kill the studio lights and let's take a look at overall performance. So I'm going to stop the video sample here, and I'm just curious, of course, chime in the comments. Which model do you think has the OLED, and which model do you think has the IPS display? The reason I'm asking all of you to chime in is because I personally was pretty surprised. Now, to reveal that, the IPS display is on the left. The OLED is on the right. I say I'm surprised by that because while I do think the OLED still offers a better overall visual experience for content consumption, things of that nature, I will tell you where it traditionally is more color accurate and really more versatile in overall use. It unfortunately appears, at least in my experience, and this is with two different OLED models, to be the opposite. It seems like the IPS display is more color accurate overall. This is not scientific. I'm speaking purely from just a visual perspective from my own eyes without any sort of metering or measurements. And one of the most concerning things about the OLED model is its inability to render blacks. So if you noticed at the beginning of this sample, the teapot overhead, it couldn't really render the image at all. It just was totally lost. And if I go back, I'll just do it on the actual touchscreen here. If I go back to the beginning, to about right here, this transition, take a look at this, and it's pretty appalling. Right here, you can see that this whole area is, and that's not glare, I assure you, I'll kill the lights, it's just missing from the actual rendering of the image. And if I do the same on the other machine, try to bring the lights back on here, and bring that to 20 seconds, you will quickly see, get it right there, the IPS does not suffer from this issue. Let me go ahead and kill the lights again, and you see that. Now, that doesn't mean that color reproduction here isn't different from one panel to the other. Of course it is. You can tell to some degree. In person, this appears to be accurate and look gray, but I can tell on my recording right now, it looks like it has a little bit more of a green tint to it, whereas the OLED doesn't seem to present that, and the gray looks more accurate. But this is something I need to point out so that everybody is aware. And this is concerning if you plan on using these for photography, videography. Granted, I wouldn't want to video edit on any Surface Pro. It doesn't mean it's impossible, and as native ARM software rolls out, things are only going to get better. But I can't help but wonder what panel was deployed here in the OLED model on the right, because under no circumstances should Microsoft's first step into OLEDs in the Surface Pro lineup somehow be close, if not in some areas be beaten by the less expensive budget-friendly IPS panel from yesteryear. I mean, this is kind of appalling. Now, granted, I have both of these HDRs disabled. They're both at around a little bit over 50% brightness, just for the purpose of the video test here on camera. Also, when talking about peak brightness, the OLED peaks at under 600 nits. And in today's world of OLEDs, that's pretty low. So again, I get this suspicion, without digging too deep into panel sourcing, that they saved money on this. And if I had to guess, it came from LG, not from Samsung. And, that's just my intuition. I could be wrong about that. Chime in if you know. I didn't go start doing the research on this because it's not that important who made the panel. It just clearly is giving markers for me, as someone who reviews devices and sees OLEDs, a wide range of them, that this is more of a budget OLED panel than it is a premium one. Now, this could all be software related, but I don't think it is. Again, chime in if you know something I don't. But this definitely left me underwhelmed when I finally had them side by side. So again, reiterating, I do think the OLED is more vibrant and gives you a more visually stunning experience, as it should. But, there are some issues. Another issue that's fairly common that many users have complained about relates to, and I'm not sure why this generic keyboard is failing me presently, relates to just overall performance when browsing the web and text clarity and things of that nature. And so what I can say to that effect is that I don't have a major problem with text clarity on the OLED, but many users across the internet are complaining about a screen door effect, a lot of them not understanding that that's not the OLED itself, but the actual touchscreen layer that has been applied to the display by Microsoft in their manufacturing process. Now, this is not something that happens on all panels. In fact, it reminds me of very early OLED displays that were touchscreen on laptops, like going back to 2019, 2020, when OLEDs just first started rolling out onto touchscreen PCs, like HP models, Dell models. That was where we saw that the OLED layer, or rather the touchscreen layer, when meshed with the OLED panel, was giving it a little bit of a screen door effect. Do I think it's more prominent here than it is here? Yes. Do I feel that somehow the OLED is unusable or hard to work with as a result? No. So I do feel that customers who are complaining about the screen door effect on the OLED, that's really more an idiosyncrasy or a nuance of their own experience than it is, I think, of a widespread issue that users will have. Almost just a matter of being a little bit more anal about it. But let's talk about moving away from the OLED versus IPS. Well, before I even do that, also just a general thing. The color white is always going to be reproduced better on an IPS display than it will predominantly on just about any OLED on the market. That doesn't really bother me. That's something I'm accustomed to. It's more of what I just showed you. The inability to display certain colors on what should be a higher fidelity experience and more accurate, color accurate experience is concerning. Let's talk about the Snapdragon X Elite versus the X Plus. Now, of course, there's a difference in cores, 12 versus 10, clock speed as well. But I'm going to tell you right here, I see absolutely no reason to have the X Elite chip versus the X Plus. And that's just in my base usage. Why is that, you ask? Well, when it comes to an ARM chip, like what we're dealing with in the Surface Pro 11 here in 2024, and the fact that we're using Microsoft's emulation layer essentially to make everything compatible, nearly everything I should say, I can't help but also point out that that means that the processor's capability is not fully being realized. And with that in mind, why on earth would we want to spend more on a beefier chip that can't even be fully utilized? Now, in native applications, inherently the X Elite chip will outperform the X Plus. But how much of that you're going to ever see is, well, kind of ridiculous, in my opinion. If this were an Intel processor and we were talking about an i5 versus an i7, I would have more to talk about, and even there, I would have very little to talk about. There would be differences in terms of thermal properties, cooling, things of that nature. But literally everything I've done with each of these, which predominantly is office-related work, as well as content consumption, there is really no difference at all. So again, the difference between the IPS and OLED variants just continues to shrink between the screen performance and, of course, the actual processor. I think the only drawback for people who maybe would rather have the IPS versus the OLED, and I can't believe I actually am starting to feel like I'm one of those people, just because of, I'll say, the mid-range performance of this OLED that Microsoft has given us, is it's shocking, again, that I would even think that way. But when you're saving the money, again, $400 to $500 US, and the majority of what you're going to be doing is office work and content consumption, which generally content consumption would be better on an OLED, I just find it nearly impossible to tell everyone that they should purchase the OLED model, also because of the nearly, impossible ability to identify a difference in the processor performance. Again, if these machines were about raw performance and they could do any form of heavy lifting, or maybe the fans kicked on more often in the X Elite versus the X Plus, which tends to be the case, obviously, with Intel variants of past days, where the i5 would run cooler than the i7 option. That's just not the case here. Fans come on just as often, which is very rare. And the same can be said about battery life, which is the next question that is obvious. What is the difference in battery life? Many of you are probably expecting that somehow one really does better than the other. And really, that's not the case. So OLEDs inherently do not use power to display dark colors. They essentially just shut the pixels off, which is much better for battery consumption, of course, because it's just not powering pixels. It doesn't need to. Much smarter and visually nearly impossible to beat. But I really haven't seen much of a battery life difference on these two machines. Really, what will come down to your battery life difference is going to be what you're consuming. So if you're web browsing and you're not in a dark theme, a dark mode, which means that the majority of what you're looking at is going to be white, imagery, text that you're reading, then the IPS display will do a little bit better on battery life. If the majority of what you're watching or reading is in dark mode, then the OLED will do better. But in mixed use and not being, again, completely anal about whether you're trying to keep things light or dark, battery life is pretty much a wash. So, and in certain instances, it's going to go one way or the other just based on peak brightness and things of that nature. A lot of people make a mistake and say, well, if I have peak brightness set the same on these, right, and I do a battery life test, this one comes out ahead or this one comes out ahead. They have different peak brightness levels. So you can't really just make each of them 50% and do a battery drain on them. It's not going to be accurate. Then also you do have to, I keep going back to this, have to get into display settings, right? So inside of display settings, we can talk about, are you using which color profile are you using? I did not leave these on Vivid because I would rather have as close to a color accurate experience for the value of this test than, the opposite. Adaptive color turned off on both. HDR off on both. In fact, I don't think most users are using HDR all the time. Of course, if you're watching a movie, it makes sense, but otherwise, the Windows experience with HDR enabled is generally you're muting more colors than you are bringing them to life. It's only going to actually be a value when, again, you're running things that are natively HDR. So just food for thought. We're not seeing any sort of battery life advantage when working with the OLED versus the IPS panel. And then when it comes to, again, the X Plus versus the X Elite, I'm really not seeing a difference. Now, might there be in some gaming? Yes. Would I recommend these for gaming? No, do not buy these with the intent to game. It doesn't mean that they can't game at all, but it is so much in its infancy, it's kind of like saying, would you buy a Mac for gaming? The answer is no. These can actually still do more than a Mac, which is crazy, but true for the most part. That's, again, like a height contest for little people, so I don't even like embarking on that. But that's why I'm not even doing a gaming test. So many people did gaming tests and demos of these machines. Thanks for doing it, so I don't have to. That's not worth doing because these machines are not meant to do that. They are meant to give you great battery life, quick recharge, be incredibly portable at roughly 2 pounds, and hopefully not break the bank if you're buying the model you actually need. So that does bring me to one thing, which is that if you go with the $1,000 model, which I think is a sound decision, and ultimately it might be the most sound decision you can make in picking one of these up, which is in some ways crazy to hear come out of my mouth simply because anyone who watched my first unboxing, I pretty much said stay away from the base model because the beauty of this generation is that we finally have an OLED. But here I am telling you, between the display and the processor, I see no reason to spend the extra money on the OLED and X Elite chip. Of course, I'm interested what all of you think, and if you do have use case scenarios where the OLED and, of course, the higher-end chipset do make financial sense, not success. Clearly no success in that. But yeah, I'm just at a point now where I'm not sure that I can recommend the OLED X Elite configurations over the base models. And that's bonkers. But the real catch-22, and this is what I was mentioning earlier in the video but lost my way, which happens when you don't script things, is that you cannot get a 32 gig model, of course, with an IPS display. You can't get a 32 gig model with the X Plus. It can only happen in the X Elite realm. And I don't think that will stop businesses or, people, consumers that want to buy the 32 gig model from buying it. I just can't help but feel like, who the hell looked at this OLED panel versus the IPS panel and said, this is going to work? Because again, the OLED panel isn't bad, but the IPS panel shouldn't be beating it in literally any form or fashion. And then, of course, the debate or the discussion about the processor comes into play that I just mentioned, and there's not much to brag about there either. And you're getting the same build quality, you're getting the same camera modules, you're getting the same AI features with Copilot and the neural processing unit. So, like, what? I don't know. I'm kind of left speechless, even though it might seem like I had a lot to say about this. If these machines were all about performance, as I mentioned earlier, and heavy lifting, it would be a different story. You would absolutely want the more powerful processor. But considering that these are both really meant to be for, just great battery life and getting things done and maybe watching a movie here and there, your favorite show, I cannot see right now, unless something changes before my final review, and I'm trying to aim for like spending a month with these before I really give anyone the final go-ahead. Right now, I can't see recommending the OLED over the regular IPS model unless you need 32 gigs of RAM. And that brings me back to the whole debate I had earlier about the difference in processor. Considering neither of these can really do any true heavy lifting, why on earth would you need 32 gigs of RAM? It's a very tough argument to make. And look, I'm not saying there aren't those of you that know you need it, and so you need it. I'm just right now presently in a camp where these are not full-blown computers. They're a step in the right direction of getting ARM to give us a full-blown Windows experience. We're almost there. But considering we're not 100% there, maybe we're 90% there, I can't see betting the farm on beefing up hardware. And the fact that the OLED seems to be more of a gripe for a lot of you, myself included, and I'm not saying I would, if they were the same price, then this becomes a much more difficult discussion. Because I think I would be willing to overlook the shortcomings of the OLED if pricing was the same. But for $400 to $500 difference to get the X Elite and an OLED, I think Microsoft has a tough time on their hands. And maybe this is why I have not found a single video on all of YouTube to compare the IPS versus OLED display. I don't know why. I mean, I know why Microsoft isn't trying to market the difference. I don't know why no one on YouTube is talking about this. It's a little bit strange. But I am. I purchased these. Microsoft is not sponsoring anything. And if they did, I would still be covering this in the exact same way. Because you just can't unsee what you can, well, physically see in terms of the capability of each of these displays. So I don't think you'll go wrong with either of these products. But if budget matters at all, and the things I've mentioned, those need to come into play, especially when the keyboard experience is so expensive. And I do think that you're best off going with a Microsoft keyboard. It doesn't have to be the Flex, latest and greatest, for $450 with the pen here. I think that's a little bit insane, but generic keyboards are going to leave a lot to be desired and are going to actually impact the overall quality of your experience with the Surface Pro 11. No question about it. And if you're curious as to how, take a look at my video covering this guy right here, which is a great value at $50. But boy, are you going to notice the trade-off. But again, overall, I think the Surface Pro 11 is a great product. You just need to know what you need, folks. And hopefully, I'm helping get you there. Still great battery life. Easily over 10 hours on both of these. So, charging up in an hour. Not the most powerful versions of the Snapdragon X processors you'll find in the crop of current Copilot PCs. But the best tablet that is a 2-in-1, no question right now, is the Surface Pro 11 here in 2024 with ARM silicon under the hood. And I'm just glad to see it finally working out because I've been, a fan and invested in ARM for over 20 years. So to see things finally become a reality in the realm of Windows, it's a good thing. Definitely a really good thing. And it means Intel and AMD have to step it up, and they're going to. Trust me. They are not going to let Snapdragon just steal their lunch. Well, that's Qualcomm. I mean, the Snapdragon X processor steal their lunch when this is their realm. But that rounds things out. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them at that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.